Well, you mentioned to me when we were chatting earlier that you do enjoy your research and you spend a lot of hours researching. Well, can you tell us a little bit about that, if you like, first of all, how you go about finding out your facts and figures?
Well, when I've sort of got an idea for a character that I think could drive a story, and I tend to begin with a person, with a character. With Doped, it was Bill Roper and then Micheline Lujan. The fact that there was this love affair between this couple where he was old enough to be her father, she was a Swiss au pair girl and so on. With Blown, it was the fact that you had this trainer, John Goldsmith, who had been in SOE in World War II. With the new one, Monsieur X, it was this character of this French professional gambler who'd also been an illegal bookie in France, this gentleman called Patrice Desmouty. I like to start with the character and then investigate their world and what happened to them and the drama of their life and their story. I've been lucky enough over the years to build up some great contacts with a lot of knowledge of and history and memory of the racing and gambling world, particularly the betting and bookmaking side. And I go to them and ask them for their help. And then nowadays, writers are very lucky. We can go and access material in the National Archives in Kew. For example, Bill Roper's trial at Lewis Crown Court, Lewis Assizes, all the documents are there in the National Archives, including a lot of the details of the police investigation. John Goldsmith's SOE file from World War II was declassified about 6 or 7 years ago. The library in Paris, the Bibliothèque Nationale, had a lot on Patrice Desmouty. Also you have the British Library in London, which has a huge store of old newspapers and magazines. Things like that are a great store of help for a writer, but you've got to put the hours in and you've got to delve away and be a bit like a detective, working through clue after clue.
Okay, you've obviously been rummaging around in the murky past for quite some time. Have you exhumed any other characters or leads that you think you might pursue in the future?
Yeah, I've got a couple of stories that I'm thinking about at the moment. One is one to do with an American racing story. In the 1950s, a great racehorse called Nashua, who won 2 legs of the Triple Crown, but not the Kentucky Derby. And he was owned by a gentleman called Billy Woodward, who was a playboy in America, son of a very rich family. And in the same year that Nashua was running in the Triple Crown, at the end of that year, Billy Woodward was shot dead by his wife, who claimed that she thought her husband was a burglar. And that was a huge scandal because she was seen to be a gold digger after his money. And it threw a fascinating spotlight on American racing in that era in the 50s, the 40s and the 50s, that kind of Mad Men period in the States. And Billy Woodward was a great friend of the James Bond creator, Ian Fleming. So any book about him, I think Ian Fleming would have to be in it. So I'm interested in that. I'd love to write something about Sir Peter O'Sullivan, who I mentioned earlier, hero worship. I know he wrote his own autobiography. I think it'd be fun to ask some of the people who knew him while they're still alive for their thoughts on Peter. And maybe I might have a crack at going back to writing a novel again, maybe try and do a better one than Easy Money.
Okay, talk the practicalities of writing. What's your tactics for getting into the zone, overcoming writer's block, etc.?
I think you've got to, if you're going to write, you've got to write every day. You've got to write every day for at least 3 or 4 hours. You've got to be disciplined about it. I don't have a shed or anything like that. I've got where we live, my wife Sarah and I, just about 3 or 4 miles outside Bath. I've got a studio that's quite sort of tucked away, and I don't have a nice view of rolling countryside. I sit and look at the wall, and I think that helps the concentration. I find that my work comes best in the early mornings for new ideas, and then sometimes in the second half of the afternoon for writing and typing things up. But you've got to stick with it. You've got to be disciplined. It doesn't come from hanging around waiting for inspiration.
Now you also have written for several titles, as diverse as The Guardian and the Financial Times, and quite a few in between. Is writing as a freelancer, is that a way of keeping the wolf from the door in between novels, or is it something you really enjoy?
Yeah, no, it was definitely a way of keeping some funds coming in days gone by. I spent about 10 years writing for the Financial Times' colour magazine with a rather amusing title, How to Spend It. And my role was to sort of tell people how to spend it at the races or at the Open Golf Championship or the Champions League final, and I enjoyed that very much. I was very lucky. I did some racing journalism years ago at The Independent when it started, and they were a great school of racing writers and sports writers. The lovely independent racing editor then, John Cobb, who's still in the business now at the Racing Post. John was an absolutely wonderful character, an absolute gentleman. And you had people like Richard Edmondson, Paul Hayward, Greg Wood, Jonathan Rendell, all these great writers coming through in The Independent then. And then I wrote for The Guardian, and did racing features for them, and did a tipping pieces for them. And I like doing all of that. I like doing racing features. I like meeting owners, trainers, gamblers, bookmakers before a big race or before a festival. People like Stephen Little, I remember years ago, going to Ireland, meeting some of the big characters there. I love doing all that. So I enjoy all the journalism very much, but I haven't had to do as much in the last 3 or 4 years, because with the film options coming in for the books, I've been more fully occupied writing those, and there's good income coming from that.
Is there anybody in the current scene, I'm throwing this at you now, I've just thought of it, that you think maybe would be a good person to write about in the same sort of vein? Not saying they're crooks, but somebody interesting enough now, rather than a historical character that you think you'd like to concentrate on?
Well, I've known the bookmaker Victor Chandler for about 20 years now, and he's a tremendous character. And Victor's history, both his father and his grandfather Bill, who founded Walthamstow Dog Stadium. Bill was the big man. He was a bit of a Don Corleone of London in the 1920s and 30s, and all that story. Bill had 7 sons. Victor's father was the youngest of them. They all had something to do with racing, gambling, dog racing. I think Victor's story is a really rich and interesting one. I would love to write that one day. I think, like a lot of people, story I'd love to do one day, but they won't let me. And I know some people that don't like them very much, and nobody would dare to do it without their permission or approval. But it would be great one day to see a story about Coolmore, about the Coolmore Mafia. I mean, what an amazing story that is. JP, John Magner, Dermot Desmond, Mr. Tabor. It's an incredible story, but I think that's one that could only be embarked upon with their blessing, shall we say.
And they know where to be in touch. Should they be
exactly.
This?
I don't think I will be taking that on an unauthorised basis.
So talking now about your current book as we speak, Monsieur X.
Yeah.
Give us a little bit of a background on that one, please.
Yeah. Well, this is a true story again, about a fascinating gentleman who was his name was Patrice Desmoutis, and he was an aristocratic Frenchman who was a passionate gambler in France in the 1950s and 60s and into the 70s. And he ran a discreet illegal bookmaking business for rich French racehorse owners in the 50s. And he was banned and warned off all French racetracks in 1953. And as people will know, bookmakers are illegal in France, and they have been since 1891. And punters there have 2 choices. Either they have to play on the wretched PMU, which is a state-run monopoly, which even now, despite final pressure from the European Union to open itself up to outside competitors, is still a very restrictive business. And the kind of bets you can have and the odds you can get and when you can bet don't appeal to proper discerning punters. He decided to take the PMU on, and he took them on with their bet the tiercé, where you have to predict the first 3 home in the correct order or any order in a particular race each week. And he applied a kind of mathematical mix of maths and inside information to his tiercé bets. If there was a 17-runner race, he'd rule out 7 of them on the basis of form and fitness, and then he'd try and back the remaining 9 or 10 in multiple combinations, using large amounts of money. And to cut a long story short, the PMU, because it's run by the French government, the French Finance Ministry and Agriculture Ministry, they started to become worried that turnover was going to drop if he was winning all the time. So they tried to change the rules to beat him. Each time he was 1 step ahead of them. Finally, there was this huge tiercé win in 1982 with 83 winning tickets. And he said none of them were anything to do with him, but it turned out a lot of them were his friends his tailor, his hairdresser, his cousin. And also 40 odd of the winning tickets were from punters with a criminal record. And it became apparent to the French authorities that this Monsieur de Mouty was mixing with the French underworld. And he became known in France as Monsieur X, that was his nickname. And people couldn't work out, is he a Robin Hood figure or is he a gangster? And he led the authorities a merry dance for about 20 years. Finally, they closed in on him. And again, a bit like Bill Roper, he had the law on one side and he had the underworld on the other. And without giving the story away too much, it didn't end well. But he was a fascinating character.
So appetite whetted for that one. Who's it published by?
It's published by Bloomsbury, and it's in hardback and Kindle, and it will be coming out in the official paperback, I think either this autumn or next spring.
Brilliant. Jamie and Reid, thank you very much for your time and for talking to us.
Thank you, Simon.